Hello, my name is Dr. Lia Jensen-Abbott, and I teach at Albion College here in Albion, Michigan. And I wanted to start out this Tempo conference video for you by telling you a little bit about the background of why I'm doing this particular session. I was very fortunate to be able to teach an honors class starting 2 falls ago, and I have always had kind of an interest in country music. I'm from Nebraska, and so I decided to explore women specifically in country music because I happen to be a huge Dolly Parton fan, amongst others, and many of you out there might be out as well. And so I got this chance to teach this class, and what I realized was that the history of country music, as well as the history of women's roles in country music, is really rich and really diverse. And none of this I knew going into teaching the course, actually. And so it's only been of late that I have kind of discovered these stories about these people. And so it got me to thinking, how could this be applied to piano? And it might seem like a funny relationship at first, but I hope you'll get some helpful and useful teaching tips. Part of the reason that I'm interested in merging these two topics, so piano pedagogy and the women of country music, is that I think that our students nowadays, they have access to all kinds of music, right? Through different streaming platforms and what have you. And while we would all probably love to think that our kiddos are listening only to classical music and piano music and all of that, more than likely that's not a typical student's repertoire as far as what they're listening to throughout their day. And I started thinking about why not have us teachers meet them somewhere in the middle. So my particular session, while I am focusing on the women in country music because it's an interest of mine and because it's a chance to tell some stories and some histories that might have been forgotten otherwise, these types of things could be applied through all genres, okay? We're always wanting our kids to listen. We always want our kids to sing at the instrument, right? I use those words all the time when I'm teaching, so do you. And I think it's nice if we can kind of borrow from maybe their world on a certain level, okay? Some of the women that I'm going to talk about are not on their level, but it's part of the history of this whole story and the whole women in country music narrative. So what I'd like to do is kind of give you just a slight beginning of women in country music. So what we think of in Nashville today had a very deep, resonant background in many sources, okay? The first one is in the mountains of Appalachia and the folk singing that was going on, starting in, the 1800s, early 1900s, and of course this had been passed down much sooner. But in the early 1900s, these women, they were poor. They often had several children to take care of. They had horrible duties of household work to do. And like many populations and communities, the women developed work songs. And those work songs were based on folk music. And of course, as in many cultures, many societies, many communities, this type of music was transmitted orally. A lot of these young women didn't go to school. None of them would have read music for the most part. And so this was all passed down. There were a lot of hardships faced in the coal mines. Women were married to coal miners. Their fathers and brothers were coal miners. And many of those folks were passing away. There was a lot of illness and certainly a lot of poverty. And the women often had not great marriages. Pregnancies were difficult. They would have a lot of pregnancies, some of them. And so many of these songs were kind of wisdom songs from one generation to the next, teaching younger women, hopefully how to have a better life, and to sing about their own struggles as a way of finding some sort of kind of common sympathy and empathy in their community, if that's a way to think about it. And so there were some songs that were sung called "On I Never Will Marry," "Single Girl." Frankie and Johnny is about an abusive relationship, for instance. So there's a lot of very interesting ballads and things that tell a lot of information. So that's kind of the starting point, if you will. And then we move on to the banner year of August 1st and 2nd, 1927. Now, what's going on is that in Bristol, Tennessee, finally, RCA and Victor Records, they were one and the same, they decided to send a record producer down to Bristol, Tennessee, because it occurred to them that there might be some money-making possibilities down in the South. They had heard about all these folk singing families and groups, and they decided to hold open auditions for recording sessions. So, into the car go three people, Maybelle Carter, A.P. Carter, and Sarah Carter. Maybelle Carter was the cousin of Sarah Carter. A.P. Carter was Sarah's husband, and A.P.'s brother was Maybelle's husband, but A.P.'s brother was not in the trio. And so the two women had children in the back seat of the car. It was hot. It was August 1927. They didn't have air conditioning, of course. Their car, the tire broke down. They had to change a tire on the way to Bristol, Tennessee. This was not an easy trip for this family, and they had no money. They were not like other recording artists that walked into a recording studio and they were well fed and they were cared for and they had practiced and they had warmed up their voices. They walked in and sat down and played a few songs cold. When the record producers at Victor heard this particular group, they were blown away and they knew that this was going to make history, and it did. So I'm going to play you a very short clip of what has now become the very first country music recording. This is the very first record recorded August 1st and 2nd, 1927 in Bristol, Tennessee. Okay, hopefully what you heard there is a genuine resonance of voices. You heard they were together. It's not the kind of like stylized singing that we hear today, the over edited and marketed commercialized recordings that we hear today, but that is the very first country music record. And the Carter family is going down in history for many, many reasons. Maybelle Carter, who is affectionately known as Mother Maybelle Carter, is the one that was playing the guitar. Maybelle was self-taught, and she learned to play guitar on her own. She had no teachers, as I said, and she developed a unique style. And the style is such that she would pluck the melody with her thumb and then strum the accompaniment in the offbeats with her other fingers. And this was a new development in sort of popular music guitar technique. And it became so well known that it was called the Carter Scratch, still is today. And this particular playing technique, which I'll give you an example of in just a moment, is so much responsible for influencing so many artists. Okay, the Carter Scratch influenced Emmylou Harris, Elvis Presley, Linda Ronstadt, Dolly Parton, Loretta Lynn. Every big name that you can think of goes back to Maybelle Carter. Maybelle Carter had children. One of them was a daughter named June Carter. So some of you know where I'm going with this. June Carter eventually married Johnny Cash. So the Carter family goes down in legendary country music history for many, many years. And so what I'd like to play for you now is a little excerpt of Maybelle Carter playing Wildwood Flower. Okay, so what you can hear there is a very prominent melody being plucked out on the guitar, okay? As we think about the instrumentation of country music, which I'll be talking about along during this video at different times, remember, we have banjos, eventually auto harps, we have guitars, and these women were proficient in many of these instruments, and I'm talking virtuosically proficient. So Maybelle Carter's revolutionary playing style can kind of be something that we can think of at our own instrument. yes, we all understand the concept of voicing. I know everyone teaches it. This is a way for students that we have that might be interested in guitar playing to kind of get them to think about our instrument in a new context. So as an example, I'm just going to do a little bit of spinning song. Okay, just that far. That's all one line. That's great. But then when we get to the sixth, I have to make a decision and I have to hear that F, right? And then I have to hear the G and I have to hear the A. So this is a little bit like Mother Maybelle, except that we're waiting, as you all know, to the pinky, right? But I think when we can give our students an example outside of the realm of our instrument and a new sound context, I think that it allows their minds to think more creatively about the sounds that they're making at the piano. And the other aspect that we have, of course, is we have an accompaniment. So again, we have several things going on between the hands, just like the guitar, right? So I know that everyone can make those connections, but again, it's something that we can sneak a little bit of interesting history. We can talk to our students in new ways. And when I teach my own son, for instance, if I can relate to something that he hears with his friends or something, he always responds a little bit differently than when I'm just teaching in the small world of our instrument specifically. Okay, part of the history of country music that has fascinated me is how it developed. So probably if you're not a country music fan, you might assume that everything grew up in Nashville. And for the most part of country music's history, that's true. But in the very beginning, so after the Carter scratch and after the 1927 Victor recordings got released the following November of 1927, they began to be broadcast not just on local radio spots around the South, but they began to be picked up by larger conglomerates. One of those conglomerates was what was called a station out of Chicago called the WLS radio station. WLS stood for the world's largest store. It was owned by the Sears Company. So those of you that remember the Sears Tower. So WLS radio broadcast at 50,000 watts. And that was enough, myself being from Nebraska, and I take the drive between Michigan and Nebraska all the time. And there's not much between Chicago and the plains of Iowa and Nebraska and Kansas. So WLS at 50,000 watts was able to be broadcast clear over into the Midwest. So it was actually WLS that had the biggest groundbreaking effect on nationalizing the popularity of country music at the time. So that was kind of a new, interesting thing for me because, again, I assumed everything came from Nashville initially. So the other part of this was that the artists were not exactly getting a lot of royalties. The Carters were not extremely wealthy. And what happened was the FCC decided to regulate the broadcasting wattage, and so it capped every station in the United States at 50,000 watts. So people got creative, right? And country music has its roots in the South and the Southwest of our country. And what's interesting is that a lot of the artists began going down to Mexico, crossing the border, and using what was called Mexican border radio. The importance of this was that Mexican border radio was not limited to 50,000 watts. As a matter of fact, it could broadcast at 500,000 or 1,000,000 watts. And there are stories that if you were in Kansas in the plains, in the Dust Bowl, you could turn on an electric fan and hear Maybelle Carter singing. Now, that's a whole interesting chapter of history that I can't go into too much because of time, but just suffice it to say that that helped artists obviously get notoriety and get their names out and become popular, but also there was a time where there was a commercialization of a lot of gimmicks, a lot of sort of like, what's the word I'm trying to think of? a lot of like health gimmicks and things like that on this radio that these commercials were peddling. And they weren't actually very safe because there was no oversight onto these things, but it did allow the artist to make money. So for every amount of whatever product was sold, the artist actually got a little bit of royalties at the time. So for what it's worth, that is one of the byproducts of this whole movement to Mexican border radio. I wanted to give you another example of voicing, and this one is the Toccatina by Kabalevsky. So if we just listen to that phrase, this is our melody, as you all know, but we have to balance it against the right hand. So if a child or a student can hear a light guitar, if you listen to Mother Maybelle, for instance, you hear Wildwood Flowers, you hear that melody being strongly plucked against very light chords. And that's the idea that we're trying to get in something like the Toccatina, okay? All right, so moving forward, because I need to kind of keep us going chronologically, moving forward in history, we are going to talk about a woman named Patsy Montana. Patsy Montana's real name was Ruby Blevins. She lived from 1908 to 1996, and she is part of one of the cross-pollinations into country music, and she brings the yodeling and the fiddler aspect into country music. Like I said, country music is rich and diverse in terms of all of the influences. We have spiritual, shape note singing, folk music, yodeling, fiddling, banjo playing, etc. And so Patsy Montana is maybe the best example of this, and I want you to hear a little bit of the yodeling technique because I think it has applications to what we do at the instrument. Okay, those of you that sing know that is actually not easy to do, especially at that tempo. So I was thinking, well, what do we have in our particular arsenal at the piano that might reflect this? And one of the things that we have is, I think, arpeggios. I think that spells it out quite a bit. Okay, there are other things that we can draw technically and musically from that kind of singing style, but if we take Bach's F major invention, for instance, so this is also a voicing piece, but we have this arpeggio idea. And as we're trying to get students to think metrically and strong beats and weak beats and technically at the piano and not to play every note too heavy, I think that this influence of yodeling might be a really great aural experience for our kids, again, to create a totally different sound concept for us to teach from. A lot of times, when I'm teaching, and I'm sure most of you do this too, I will emulate a violinist or I will emulate a singer. You don't want to hear me sing, by the way. But, I'm always using other instruments and other influences to try to help our students create the sound that they need to have at the piano. So why not borrow from other musical types as well? And in this case, Patsy Montana was a real pioneer. She was fairly famous. She had a great life. She was very well-to-do, and she really influenced country music quite a bit. This is where you kind of get that Western sound. She also was one of the women that happened to really start to work for what we call kind of the country music look that women had from the West. And so Patsy Montana is a big player, so to speak, in the story of country music. But for our lives, the idea of the arpeggio and the yodeling, I think, might actually open up, as I said, a new sound world for our students to be able to hear how to jump and how to move and how to make arpeggios not feel so kind of difficult and feel caught up in the keys technically, and to tighten up, to have tension. So maybe hearing something like yodeling will be useful for your studio at times. So that's one example. Now, as a way to get to another potential idea of this, yodeling, I felt like, also has a cross relation with left hand pattern. we all have waltzes, we all have arpeggios in all kinds of our music from every style period, okay? And waltzes, of course, have the very difficult left hand. So working on, again, the whole idea of shifting at the piano is difficult, right? And a lot of students will play, you know, they'll play the second and third beats too heavy. And again, I think the yodeling model teaches that lightness in a way that maybe will speak to a student in a different way, perhaps. This happens to be a Florence Price Waltz of the Spring Maid. So just something to think about. I know it's not an arpeggio, but the idea of that skip and shift and all of that hand position shifts are one of the major technical problems with the piano, right? It creates tension as we move. Kids can miss notes. And I think that the yodeling aspect really helps us to open up and to feel more relaxed at the instrument when you hear someone like Patsy Montana doing these vocal gymnastics so easily and so virtuosically on these recordings. So that's another example as far as using these patterns. Then we move on to maybe one of my favorite things, and that is the idea of the honky-tonk. The honky-tonk style developed down in Texas, and it had its sort of derivation in literally pianos that were kind of out of tune, that were kind of brassy, but it also became a style of music. And interestingly, as I was listening back through some of these historical recordings, I decided upon something by Rose Maddox, who again is a very famous singer in this world at a certain point. She lived from 1925 to 1998, believe it or not. And so here's an example of Rose Maddox. And so I just love that. I mean, her growl, her vocal growls, and the big leaps that she makes. And there's also some grace notes in there, if you heard it. Her attack on the notes, there were little slides. Well, we have grace notes in every style of music that we play at the piano, right? I'm not saying you want your students always to growl at the piano, but I just thought, well, okay, how could this help us in terms of teaching maybe grace notes, for instance? So this is an adorable piece by Leah Claiborne called Chit Chat. And I think that just calls for that growling idea, right? It's really jazzy. And again, it gives this little expressive idea. And as we all know, trying to understand, kids get caught up in the technicalities of playing grace notes when they first work on them. And, you know, trying to explain it and trying to have the student relax at the keyboard. And it seems to me that having, again, this vocal model, not from something classical, but rather from something out of, you know, a different genre, which in this case is country music. It also is kind of fun to listen to. It's a cute song. It's called Honky Tonkin', shockingly. And I just thought, why not start to apply, as I said, these different sound contexts to the piano to help us broaden our world and to meet our students part way from where a lot of their days are spent. Most of our kids have earbuds on, right? Most of our students play music when they're walking between classes, when they're with their friends, when they're in the car. At least that's my experience with my son. Or he's playing video games, which has a different kind of music going on. So why not help our kids to understand things while, while we're in their world, so to speak, if that makes sense. One of the other fun aspects of country music is the phenomenon called rockabilly. And rockabilly gets its name literally from combining a lot of different sources, okay? Rock and hillbilly and putting them together in kind of a fusion. And so we are talking about, in the north part of the United States, the R&B of Chuck Berry and Little Richard and rock and roll. But down south, when country began adding, you know, a little bit of extra sound flair, a little bit of rhythmic vibrancy, a little more percussion, with singing with hiccups and cries and you know, sliding between notes and all of this, really rockabilly is kind of an amalgam of country, swing, rock and blues, and gospel all put together, and that's the rockabilly style. And so one example of this, many of you would know Jerry Lee Lewis. Most of us would, if we are of a certain wonderful age group. And Jerry had a sister named Linda Gale Lewis. And Linda Gale was just as good at playing boogie woogie piano as her brother. And Linda Gale Lewis, I think, kind of personifies this, and she was incredibly virtuosic at the piano. So here's a brief excerpt. Okay, there's a lot going on there technically. There's the left-hand patterns that you have to maintain while you're doing the right-hand patterns. Now, this is no different than a complex etude or any other technical passage at the piano, either for one hand or two, right? My son is working on this musette. Right? So he's got the left hand that he has to contend with. Now, Charlie is 11 and he's a tall kid, but that octave is still, he needs to do this, right? We don't want our kids to play, you know, like this, obviously. So here's an example of a boogie woogie bass, you know, way back. And so that's one aspect of this technically. Again, if you hear Linda Gale Lewis, it's an example outside of our repertoire scope that lets kids hear something that's similar, but in a different style. I think that allows them to kind of have fun, to relax about it, because sometimes maintaining those octaves for quite a long time can be a technical challenge, as many of you know. Another example of this is William Gillock's Boogie Prelude, right? So you have a boogie woogie bass right at the beginning. Okay, that doesn't get any more boogie woogie than that, right? So this is an actual ramification and a similar crossover piece that our students have to adapt to that style, right? So what better way to do that than to play some Linda Gale Lewis? She's also a trailblazer. These women that are able to perform in their medium and make it in country music, they had many, many obstacles, by the way. It wasn't like Nashville, when Nashville became the center of country music. It wasn't like it just welcomed women with open arms and said, we're going to let any woman come in and make a solo recording. That's not the way that this worked. Women had to fight and scratch to get to where they wanted to be. So this was all developing through the years. When we get to the 1960s, we have a folk music revival. So country music had gone off and done the western swing and the rockabilly and honky tonk. And by about the 1960s, as is the case with other genres in this country, folk music started coming back. And with folk music has an authenticity to it, the stories and the words, and we all probably at some point in our lives have listened to folk singing. And I think one of my favorites, this is just me, is Joni Mitchell. And here's a little bit of both sides now. So everybody's got to love Joni Mitchell. And believe it or not, Joni was part of country music, because country music went back and took a look back at its history and began to say, you know what, these texts, these melodies, these instrumentations can really help enliven our stories and can enliven our singing and our music. And so a lot of artists looked back at folk music. Well, in our world, we have folk music. Chopin looked at folk music. The mazurkas for him are folk music, right? So here is a little bit of Opus 24, number 2. Right? We've got got grace notes, we've got this triplets melodies, we've got these modal harmonies going on. This was Chopin's experimental laboratory. So why not give our students an idea that, hey, folk music wasn't just back in Chopin's time. In fact, lots of composers looked at folk music. Bartók recorded it, right, and listened to it and transcribed it. So here's a little bit of a Hungarian folk song. Very stepwise melody, but it's one that he probably transcribed. So we are very, very close to folk music in our world, in our teaching world, and why not give our students that ability to sort of work within those related sound contexts? And you know, it's always fun to listen to Joni Mitchell. Moving on, finally, around the 1960s, 1950s, 1960s, Nashville begins to develop what they call the Nashville Sound. And we will still hear ramifications of this today. The Nashville Sound involved a stylized artist dressed very nicely. And in the case of women, they would be in beautiful gowns, and they would be accompanied by a lot of stringed instruments to fill in the textures. There would be choirs backing them up, okay? And the best example of this, and one of the most famous country women singers, was Patsy Cline. So here's a little bit from her song, Crazy.
Crazy, I'm crazy for feeling so lonely.
Okay, now if you hear that, Patsy, her voice is just one of the greatest voices of her generation. As many of you probably know, Patsy died in a plane crash. Actually, I'm filming this on March 5th, and so this is the anniversary of the plane crash that killed Patsy Cline. She was in a very, very dysfunctional marriage. She had 2 children. She died at the young age of 30 years old, so we lost her way too soon. Crazy was one of her hits, and Patsy was in a car crash a few years before she died that nearly killed her. It broke her pelvis, it broke her leg. She had scars on her head after that she had to cover with makeup. But Patsy was the quintessential queen. She had gorgeous outfits, and of course there was that voice. But if you listen to that particular arrangement, you also hear lovely piano accompanying her, as well as, like I said, percussion, strings, a choir, everything in the background, and that was the Nashville Sound package. Okay, how does this resonate? Well, as a little fun fact, if you didn't know, the person that wrote the song Crazy was someone named Willie Nelson. So Patsy Cline is kind of responsible for really instigating Willie Nelson's career. And Crazy happens to open up with a descending major 6th. And this is Florence Price's Reverie. So if you listen to that, that's difficult to voice because of how the texture is written, because you have these intervening chords. So why not listen to Patsy Cline singing that particular interval? I'm not saying it's the same genre. It's not even the same expressive effect between these 2 pieces, obviously. But there are some similarities in the sense that understanding the background sounds, in this case of the Nashville Sound, and those recordings that came out of the studios at that time, really kind of, I think, helps our students to have a sense of, hey, this inner chord is really like those strings playing, right? It's a way to kind of draw upon other musical influences to help our students technically be able to feel the difference between those melody and accompaniment notes and to balance everything at the piano. It also can help with pedaling because they can hear those sustained sounds, but they're never cloudy, they're never muddy at all. And so, listening to Patsy Cline, I don't think is ever a bad thing. And she was an incredible person, and we lost her too young. And I have to move forward, and one of the greats is Loretta Lynn. And Loretta Lynn was born in 1932, and she died in 2022. So she was 90 years old when she died. If you know Loretta's story, she had several brothers and sisters. They grew up in poverty, and Loretta married at the age of 13. By the time she was 18, she had 4 children. Her husband picked her up from Kentucky and moved them clear out to Washington. They weren't doing very well financially, and he recognized that Loretta might have some musical talent. Loretta would, when she was alone, she would write songs and kind of fiddle them out on the guitar and figure them out. And so he kind of pushed her to go do singing competitions. She was very shy. She didn't want to. She was in a 60-year abusive marriage. Loretta pushed herself. She was so endeared towards her fans. She would sing somewhere in the range of 285 to 300 concerts a year. She had 6 children by the time she was done having kids overall. And she was trying to balance being a mother, being an international superstar, touring, dealing with fans. And, this wasn't really back in the day. They didn't have luxury tour buses early on. So these were cold, uncomfortable buses. She was on the road a lot in bad weather. And Loretta was just an amazing force. And I turned to one of her songs. Her father was a coal miner, and he, of course, died from black lung. And she is most famous, one of her songs, for the tune Coal Miner's Daughter. Okay, Loretta is kind of known for speaking to the working class. This is what drew people to her, because she didn't just sing about it, she lived it, literally. And these songs resonated with people who were maybe financially in dire straits. Maybe women were in bad marriages. Maybe they were just feeling beaten down because they were trying to do all the work of raising a lot of kids. But Loretta's message and her texts were just, they spoke to so many people. And I kind of call this sort of a simplicity. And I wanted to play a little bit from Ivan Sings, because this is kind of the same idea. So we have this idea at the piano of pretty simplistic melody. We have a descending fourth and then these very lamenting half steps before we finally land on the long note F. And this to me kind of resonates with Loretta Lynn's sort of real world messages, right? A lot of the pieces that our students play, a lot of the character pieces are about something that we can relate to. And why not give them a little slice of country music and let them hear something else that people can relate to? And it gives them a little history lesson as well to understand these women that have played such a major role in the development of one of the biggest genres in American pop music history. So Loretta is just somebody that you can't not talk about. Sorry about the double negative. Another person that we all have to think about is Dolly Parton. And Dolly Parton was born in 1946. Sadly, she just lost her partner, her husband, Carl Dean, just a few days ago. Dolly is known for so many things, but talking about living the experience, Dolly was born with 12 kids in her family. They literally lived in a one-room cabin, and they had no working bathrooms in the house, and so she really grew up impoverished. Her mother helped her develop her singing. Her mother encouraged her to do what she did, and she left home, and of course, the story is history, as we know. But Dolly Parton is also one of these people that is an amazing philanthropist. I've been fortunate enough that my son was able to have the opportunity to be a part of the Imagination Library, which Dolly Parton founded. She gives books to children from the time that they are 5 every month, from the time that they're born until they're 5 years old. So that's a lot of books that she's giving to kids, because education is very important to Dolly. So Dolly is just a world phenom, as we know. She's one of the few people to be inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame, as well as the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And I wanted to play you just a little clip of a quote, I Will Always Love You. Sorry. So Dolly Parton wrote that song. If you've seen The Bodyguard with Whitney Houston probably has maybe the most famous version of this. But a little history lesson for everyone is that at Nashville Studio B, Elvis Presley picked up Dolly Parton's song and wanted to sing it. And so Tom Parker contacted Dolly, and Tom Parker wanted Elvis to get most of the royalties, and Dolly just didn't feel business-wise that was the smartest decision. She desperately wanted Elvis to sing that song, but because of Tom Parker's meddling, Elvis never got to record it, which is really, really sad. The reason I chose this excerpt by Dolly is because we have long notes that you have to match the decay to. And that is one of the hardest things to teach our students, right? To listen to a long melodic note at the piano and then to match the decay so you don't have a bump. So I just picked William Gillock's Lazy Bayou just as an example of this. So you have this beautiful accompaniment. And now the melody comes in, just as an example. So if we listen to that, I have to voice that chord, and then that note, the F, and then we have a big jump down, a major sixth. So as students listen to that, I don't want that F to be too loud, right? And so we have to learn to match that in our ear. And what better way, again, it's very easy for children and older students to imitate something that they've heard. Now, we can demonstrate at the piano, and that's always effective, but why not give them a singer, especially in a different genre? Because sometimes our kids' ears will perk up when they hear something maybe they've never heard before. And so Dolly does such a great job of matching those pitches. You know, she wasn't formally musically trained, but she has incredible instincts, and her songwriting skills are, you know, bar none, of course. And she is also a wonderful person. So it's a chance to teach our students a little bit about, you know, a really remarkable figure in history, just through her philanthropy and her kindness, but also her artistic gifts. So I'm about out of time, but I wanted to just give you a couple other little excerpts, because it's always kind of nice if we can kind of move forward in music history to a few people that are a little more current. So I wanted to play an excerpt from Trisha Yearwood. Now, Trisha stands for something really remarkable, because Trisha is one of these women, after the Loretta Lynns, after the Patsy Clines, we began to have this movement in Nashville where women solo artists could really make it. And this was important because that was not always the case. And so Trisha and other folks were kind of standing on the shoulders of these great women. And another person that we should probably bring up is Faith Hill. Faith Hill is another big name. Faith Hill and Tim McGraw are superstars in the country music industry. And I would be remiss if I didn't bring up one of my all-time favorites, Reba McEntire. Now, in all of these recordings, I have to close, but in all of these recordings, you hear this wonderful stylized sound, very thick textures, very thick accompaniments, lots of guitar, banjo, auto harp, percussion, strings, choirs, etc. And backing up these remarkable women. Reba McEntire is a force. She's a great actress as well. Trisha Yearwood has jumped into singing the American Songbook in addition to country. And so these women are incredible role models as well. So I hope that I've given you a few teaching ideas to mess around with in your studios and to give your students a different perspective and a new sound context. Thank you so much to MTNA, and I hope you're having a wonderful conference.